My boyfriend said, "I don't like your kids from your previous marriage being here this much." I said, "Okay." Then I ended the relationship before the pizza dough on my kitchen counter had finished rising. My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 32 years old, a structural engineer, divorced for 3 years, and the mother of 2 children who matter more to me than anyone I will ever date. That sounds obvious now. At the time, it wasn't. I never loved Evan more than my children. The problem was that I kept finding excuses for things that should have bothered me much sooner. But when you spend enough time with someone, you start explaining away things that should make you uncomfortable. You call them stress. You call them personality differences. You tell yourself they're adjusting. Looking back, I did that for months. Evan Pierce moved into my house 7 months before everything fell apart. He was 28, polished, ambitious, charming in a way that impressed people almost immediately. Friends liked him. Coworkers liked him. My neighbors liked him. Even my kids liked him. At least in the beginning. Henry was 9 and talked like he was being paid per word. Alice was 7 and somehow managed to leave glitter behind wherever she went. They weren't perfect children. They were loud. They forgot things. They left shoes in hallways and cereal bowls in places cereal bowls had no business being. They were also my favorite people on earth. Evan never openly complained about them at first. If he had, I probably would have ended things much sooner. Instead, it happened in smaller ways. When custody week started, he always seemed a little less enthusiastic. He suddenly needed quiet whenever the kids were home, and during family movie nights, he usually found a reason to disappear into another room. None of it was serious enough to start a fight over. Individually, each moment seemed harmless. Together, they told a story I didn't want to hear. I met Evan about a year and a half after my divorce from Mason. Mason and I had figured out a stable co-parenting routine. We weren't especially close, but we respected each other, and we both showed up for our kids. The arrangement worked surprisingly well. The kids moved between 2 homes on a schedule that Mason and I had spent months figuring out, and for the most part, there was very little drama. Then Evan entered my life, and for a while, it felt easy. He brought flowers, remembered birthdays, and never forgot to text me good morning. After years of managing work, bills, school pickups, doctor appointments, and everything else that comes with raising children, being cared for felt nice. Really nice. That feeling can make you overlook things. I certainly did. The first major warning should have been how much Evan cared about appearances. Everything had to look right, from the living room and dining room to the photos on the walls, and even the way conversations sounded. He once spent 15 minutes explaining why Alice's colorful dollhouse clashed with the aesthetic of the family room. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The house itself meant a lot to me. I bought it after my divorce when it was practically falling apart. The wiring was a disaster. The paint was peeling. Half the room smelled like old dust and regret. I rebuilt it room by room. I poured countless paychecks, weekends, and spare hours into fixing it. By the time Evan moved in, it finally felt like home. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like ours. Mine, Henry's, and Alice's. Friday nights were my favorite. If I had the energy, we made homemade pizza. If I didn't, we ordered takeout and watched movies under a pile of blankets. A complete lack of organization. That Friday started exactly the same. Henry was explaining dinosaur bite force to Alice. Alice was pretending to listen. I was covered in flour. Then the front door opened. Evan stepped inside, took one look around the house, and went quiet. I knew that look. The one where he was mentally cataloging everything that annoyed him. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the sneakers near the stairs, the Lego pieces on the coffee table, and the blanket fort that had taken over part of the living room. Alice ran past him wearing a blanket tied around her shoulders. "Hi, Evan!" "Careful," he said automatically. She immediately slowed down. I noticed it. The way she adjusted herself, the way she became cautious in her own home. Something about that bothered me. I wiped my hands on a towel. "Everything okay?" Evan grabbed a bottle of sparkling water and leaned against the counter. "It's just a lot." "What is?" "The noise, the clutter." I glanced around. The house looked exactly like it always did during custody week. Lived in. Happy. A little chaotic. "Henry left a toy car in the foyer," he continued. I stepped on it. "They're kids." "I know." He rubbed his forehead. Then he looked at me with the expression he used whenever he thought he was being especially reasonable. "I've been thinking." That sentence immediately made me nervous. Because people rarely announce they've been thinking right before saying something wonderful. "What about?" He took a drink. "This schedule." "What schedule?" "The custody schedule." My stomach tightened. In the living room, Henry laughed at something Alice said. Evan's eyes flicked toward the sound. The reaction lasted less than a second. Still, I saw it. "I just think things have become difficult." "For who?" "For us." The answer irritated me instantly. "Us?" He nodded. "I need home to feel peaceful. Every other week, the entire atmosphere changes. I stared at him. Because my children are here. Exactly. The way he said it made the room feel colder. I set the rolling pin down. What are you trying to say? He hesitated. Not because he was unsure, because he was figuring out how to phrase it. Finally, he said, I don't think having them here this often is working anymore. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. You mean Henry and Alice? Yes. The casual way he said it made everything worse. I don't like your kids from your previous marriage being here this much. It affects us. Maybe when it's your custody week, you could spend more time at Mason's place. Or maybe they could stay there more often. For a second, I just looked at him. I waited, convinced there had to be more to what he was saying. Some clarification. Some explanation that would make it sound less ridiculous. Something that would make the sentence less insane. Instead, he kept going. I'm not saying don't see them. I'm just saying this house should feel like ours. Ours. That word landed badly. This house had my name on every document. My savings built it. My children grew up inside it. Their drawings were taped inside kitchen cabinets. Their height marks were on the pantry wall. Their toothbrushes were upstairs. And somehow Evan had convinced himself he was entitled to negotiate their presence. You don't want my children here. That's not what I said. It is. No, Clara, you're twisting it. I am? He sighed. I'm trying to protect our relationship. I looked past him. Henry and Alice were still playing. Neither of them knew a grown man was standing in the kitchen trying to reduce their place in their own home. I felt something settle inside me. What I felt wasn't anger. It was certainty, sudden and impossible to ignore. Okay, I said. Evan relaxed immediately. He thought I understood. He thought I was agreeing. I knew you'd see my point. I untied my apron. You're right about one thing. His smile widened. What's that? Priorities matter. Then I looked him straight in the eye. We're done. His smile disappeared. What? The relationship. You're serious? Yes. Clara, come on. I shook my head. You asked me to make my children smaller so your life would be easier. There's nothing left to discuss. His expression hardened. You're overreacting. No, I'm reacting exactly enough. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine anger flash across his face. This is my home too. No, I said quietly. It isn't. The room went completely silent. Evan stared at me. I stared back. Neither of us moved. Eventually, he said, You'll regret this. Maybe he expected me to argue. Maybe he expected me to cry. Instead, I walked into the living room. Henry and Alice immediately looked up. Children always know when something is wrong. They just don't always know what. I forced a smile. Who wants ice cream before pizza? Henry practically launched himself off the couch. Alice smiled too, but she kept glancing toward the kitchen. Is Evan upset? He's dealing with grown-up problems, I said. That's not your responsibility. We grabbed our jackets and headed for the door. As we left, I glanced back once. Evan was still standing in the kitchen, exactly where I'd left him. The pizza dough sat untouched on the counter between us. Still rising. Still unfinished. Unlike the relationship, that part was over. The ice cream shop was only 10 minutes from the house, but it felt much farther that night. Henry spent most of the drive arguing that mint chocolate chip was objectively superior to every other flavor ever invented. Alice disagreed with the confidence of a future trial attorney. By the time we reached the shop, they were debating ice cream as if national security depended on it. Normally, I would have joined in. Instead, I sat across from them, trying to process what had just happened. The strange thing was that I didn't feel heartbroken. A relationship ending is supposed to feel dramatic. There's supposed to be grief, confusion, second-guessing. I felt relief. I was relieved, but I was disappointed too. Part of me couldn't believe he had actually said it out loud. Because the conversation in the kitchen hadn't created a problem. It had exposed one. The more I replayed it, the more obvious it became that Evan hadn't slipped up. He hadn't said something reckless in the heat of an argument. He had planned that conversation. He had spent time thinking about it. Then he had decided it was reasonable. That part bothered me most. By the time we got home, the porch lights were glowing and the neighborhood had settled into its usual Friday night quiet. I sat in the driveway for a moment before turning off the engine. Henry leaned forward between the seats. Is Evan still grumpy? I almost smiled. Probably. Did we do something? No. The answer came out faster than I intended. Both kids looked at me. No, I repeated more gently. You didn't do anything wrong. Henry seemed satisfied. Alice didn't. She kept studying my face. Alice kept studying my face in a way that made it obvious she knew more was going on than I was telling her. What happened then? I thought about how to answer. The truth was too complicated. The full story belonged to adults. Sometimes, I said carefully, grown-ups learn things about each other that they didn't know before. Alice considered that. Then she nodded slowly. Apparently that answer was enough. For now, the second we walked into the house, I felt the tension. Evan was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open. He looked up immediately. Not at the kids. At me. I didn't need him to say anything else. The conversation wasn't over in his mind. He was waiting for round two. Henry gave him a small wave. Hey. Hey. That was it. No smile. No question about ice cream. No interest. Just a single word before his attention returned to me. It was such a small interaction that I probably wouldn't have noticed it 6 months earlier. Now it stood out. Every little thing stood out. After getting the kids showered, fed, and settled into bed, I came downstairs around 10. Evan was exactly where I'd left him, waiting. I think you're overreacting. No greeting. No apology. Straight to business. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet. I don't. You're ending a relationship over one conversation. One conversation? His expression tightened. You know what I mean. I filled the glass with water. No, I think I'm ending it because of a lot of conversations I ignored. That's ridiculous. Is it? Yes. He stood up. You act like I told you to get rid of your children. You suggested they spend less time in their own home. That's not what I meant. Then tell me what you meant. He opened his mouth. Stopped. Started again. I meant we need balance. I almost laughed. Balance. Interesting word. Tell me something, Evan. What exactly have you balanced? His forehead creased. What's that supposed to mean? When you wanted the guest room turned into an office, we did it. You agreed to that. When you wanted the dining room repainted, we repainted it. You liked the color. When you complained that the kids' drawings were cluttering the walls, I spent an entire weekend buying frames. His jaw tightened. You're making me sound selfish. No, I said. I'm describing what happened. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Finally, he said, You're acting like I'm the bad guy. I'm acting like a mother. That landed harder than I expected. His face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because beneath all the frustration, I could see something else. Beneath the frustration, I could see fear. Not of losing me, but of losing the life he had built around me. You'll calm down, he said eventually. The certainty in his voice surprised me. You really think that? Yes. Why? Because this isn't who you are. I stared at him. The irony was almost painful. Because for the first time in months, I felt exactly like myself. What happens now? He asked. You move into the guest room. His laugh was immediate. No. Yes. I'm not sleeping in the guest room. Then find somewhere else. Seriously? Yes. The disbelief on his face told me he still thought this was temporary. A fight. A cooling off period. Something that would disappear if he waited long enough. I wished I could say I understood why he thought that. Maybe I'd been too accommodating. Maybe I'd spent too much time smoothing over conflict. Maybe I'd taught him that persistence eventually got him what he wanted. Whatever the reason, he genuinely seemed convinced that this would blow over. It wouldn't. The next morning proved it. I came downstairs expecting awkwardness. Instead, I found Evan drinking coffee in my bathrobe. My bathrobe. At first, I thought it was an accident. Then I realized it wasn't. It was territory. A tiny act of defiance disguised as normal behavior. We need to talk about the living situation, he said. Actually, we don't. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means you'll be getting formal notice. The words finally seemed to register. Not emotionally. Legally. You're serious. Yes. You can't just throw me out. I'm not throwing you out. I opened the refrigerator. I'm following the law. This is insane. No, I said calmly. What's insane is asking a parent to downgrade their children so your life feels more comfortable. His frustration finally broke through. We're still talking about that? That sentence told me more than anything else he'd said. In his mind, the issue wasn't what he'd asked for. The issue was that I wouldn't move past it, as though the real inconvenience was my memory. The conversation went nowhere after that. By lunchtime, we were both exhausted. By evening, things got worse. I walked into the master bedroom and immediately stopped. Half of Evan's belongings had been moved back in. Half of Evan's belongings had found their way back into the room. Boxes lined the wall. His shoes sat by the closet, and several electronics and personal items were already spread throughout the room. Looking around the room, it was clear what he was doing. He wasn't getting ready to leave. He was settling back in, as if the breakup had never happened. When he appeared in the doorway, his arms were crossed. I'm sleeping here. I looked around the room, then back at him. No. He blinked. No? No. His voice hardened. I'm not sleeping in the guest room. Then that sounds like a problem you need to solve. The frustration that flashed across his face wasn't the reaction of a heartbroken man. It was the reaction of somebody losing control. That distinction became clearer every day. Later that evening, I called Mason. Not because I needed permission. Not because I needed advice. Because co-parents owe each other honesty when something affects their children. He listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, he sighed. I always wondered. Wondered what? Whether he actually liked them. The question stung because I'd wondered the same thing. I just hadn't wanted to answer it. He was always polite, Mason continued. Yeah, but he never seemed interested. That was exactly it. Polite. Not invested. Not attached. Just polite. The difference felt obvious now. Before hanging up, Mason made me an offer. If things get ugly, I can keep the kids a little longer. I appreciated it more than I could explain. Because underneath everything else, both of us were thinking about the same thing. Henry and Alice. Always Henry and Alice. I promised him I'd be careful. 2 days later, Evan's mother showed up. And somehow, things became even more complicated. I knew Barbara Pierce was arriving before she even got out of her car. Some people announced themselves without saying a word. Barbara had that talent. The oversized sunglasses, the expensive handbag, the expression that suggested every problem in the world had been caused by somebody else. Specifically, somebody younger. Specifically, me. I was in the garage organizing shelves when her SUV pulled into the driveway. She got out, looked around my property like she was inspecting a hotel she'd paid too much for, and walked straight toward me. Clara. Not hello. Not how are you. Just Clara. I set down my drill. Barbara. This situation has gotten completely out of hand. I almost laughed. She had been standing in my driveway for less than 10 seconds and had already skipped straight to blaming me. Has it? Yes. She crossed her arms. Evan told me everything. That was unfortunate. Because I had a strong feeling she'd only heard the version that made him sound reasonable. And what exactly did he tell you? Her expression tightened. That you're throwing him out because he expressed concerns about the children. She kept referring to them as the children instead of Henry and Alice, and for some reason, that bothered me more than it should have. The phrase bothered me more than it should have. They have names. What? My children have names. Barbara blinked, then sighed as though I were making things difficult. That's not the point. It usually is. For the next 20 minutes, she delivered a speech that sounded suspiciously rehearsed. Relationships required sacrifice. Good partners made compromises. Blended families were complicated. Evan deserved consideration. Evan deserved patience. Evan deserved understanding. I noticed something interesting. Not once did she mention what Henry and Alice deserved. Eventually, I interrupted. Let me ask you something. Barbara stopped talking. What? If somebody told Evan he should spend less time with his future children, what would you say? Her face changed instantly. That's completely different. Why? Because it is. I smiled. That answer usually means somebody doesn't actually have one. She shifted tactics. You've always been very protective of those children. The way she said those children made my stomach tighten. There was something dismissive about it, like they were obstacles instead of people. They're my kids. I know. No, I said quietly. I don't think you do. For the first time all afternoon, she looked genuinely annoyed. Clara, you're making this far bigger than it needs to be. Actually, Evan did that. Her jaw clenched. You know what I mean. I did. She wanted me to smooth everything over, to become reasonable, to restore the comfortable version of reality where her son got what he wanted. Unfortunately, I wasn't interested. When she finally left, her goodbye was noticeably colder than her arrival. That didn't bother me. What bothered me was the look on Evan's face when he realized the conversation hadn't gone his way. He'd been watching from the front window. I caught him as Barbara's SUV disappeared down the street. You called her. He didn't deny it. What was I supposed to do? The answer slipped out before I could stop it. Grow up? His expression darkened immediately. The rest of the evening was tense. Not explosive. Just tense, like two people standing on opposite sides of a frozen lake, both waiting to see where the ice would crack first. A few days later, it did. A couple of times before things completely fell apart, Evan tried to explain how he saw the situation. He said he felt like he had moved into a life that already existed without him. The house carried years of memories he wasn't part of. The routines revolved around the kids. Even small decisions often started with what was best for Henry and Alice. I didn't agree with the conclusion he reached, but I could understand how he had convinced himself that he was being pushed aside. The problem was that he never seemed to understand the difference between joining a family and competing with one. The first notification appeared while I was sitting in a project meeting. Then another. Then 5 more. By lunchtime, my phone looked like it had developed a personal grudge. Most of the alerts came from online review platforms connected to my firm's business pages. At first, I assumed it was spam. Then I started reading. The reviews all painted the same picture. According to them, I was cold, controlling, unstable, and manipulative. The reviews were clearly fake. The wording changed. The story stayed the same. Somebody was trying very hard to create a specific narrative. I sat at my desk reading them one by one. The accusations themselves didn't bother me nearly as much as the effort behind them. Whoever organized this wanted consequences. Real consequences. The more I dug, the more obvious the source became. Several accounts were connected to people who knew Evan. A few had interacted with his social media posts. One even used a profile picture I'd seen before. That evening I came home and found him sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in. Something about his expression felt different. Satisfied. Not openly. Just enough. I stood in the doorway. Tough day? His mouth twitched. What happened? The performance wasn't convincing. I dropped my purse onto the table. Interesting reviews. His eyes stayed on me. Reviews? Mm-hmm. A tiny pause. Then he shrugged. People have opinions. That was all I needed. I spent the next several days gathering evidence. I started collecting screenshots, dates, usernames, posts, messages, and anything else that might help establish a pattern. Engineering had taught me something valuable years ago. You don't argue with evidence. You collect it. The deeper I looked, the more reckless the entire thing became. Many of the posts were appearing during business hours. Some accounts belonged to people connected to Evan's workplace. The timeline practically organized itself. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in ending the harassment. So I put everything into a folder and sent it to the Human Resources Department at Evan's company. Then I went back to work. 3 days later, my phone rang. Evan, I answered. The second I heard his voice, I knew the meeting hadn't gone well. Did you contact HR? No greeting. No small talk. Straight to the point. Sounds like they contacted you. You had no right. I leaned against my car in the grocery store parking lot. You organized a harassment campaign. I didn't organize anything. The denial would have sounded stronger if he hadn't skipped straight to panic. What happened? Silence. Then, I got written up. I waited. There was also a bonus review. And another silence. Longer this time. My bonus is gone. The thing about consequences is that they always feel unfair when you're meeting them for the first time. Evan sounded genuinely shocked. Not by what he'd done. By the fact that it had cost him something. You could have ruined my career. I looked out across the parking lot. No, Evan. My voice stayed calm. You brought your career into a personal fight. Those aren't the same thing. He hung up. The next few days were miserable. Not dramatic. Just exhausting. The next few days were exhausting. Cabinet doors slammed, music blasted at odd hours, lights stayed on all night, and dirty dishes seemed to multiply in the sink. One afternoon, I walked into the house and nearly melted. The thermostat was set to 90 degrees. Outside, it was 62. Henry walked into the hallway behind me and immediately frowned. Why does it feel like Florida in here? I laughed so hard I had to sit down. The kid wasn't wrong. The situation would have been funny if it weren't so ridiculous. What worried me more was how the atmosphere affected the children. They were adapting. Quietly. Too quietly. One evening during dinner, Henry started telling me about a bridge building project at school. He was excited. Really excited. Halfway through the explanation, Evan sighed loudly. Just one sigh. That was all. Henry stopped talking. The enthusiasm vanished from his face almost instantly. The rest of dinner continued. The story didn't. Later that night, I found Henry sitting alone in his room. He wasn't reading. He wasn't playing. He was staring out the window. I sat beside him. Everything okay? He shrugged. That answer usually meant no. We sat there for a minute before he finally spoke. Does Evan not like us? The question hit harder than anything Barbara had said. Harder than the reviews. Harder than the arguments. Because it came from my son. A child should never have to wonder whether he's welcome in his own home. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders. You don't need to worry about Evan. But does he? I looked at him. Then I answered honestly. I think Evan cares a lot about what he wants. Henry considered that. Then nodded slowly. Henry didn't say anything else, but the look on his face told me he'd already figured out more than I wanted him to. The following Friday, everything finally came to a head. The day itself started normally enough. Henry came home excited about a bridge building competition at school. Alice burst through the front door carrying construction paper covered in glitter and announced she had made a dragon that was also, apparently, a princess. The dragon princess explanation lasted nearly 10 minutes, and I listened to every second of it. I loved hearing her talk, especially because I'd started noticing how often both kids checked the room before speaking, as if they were making sure it was safe first. That realization stayed with me all afternoon. By dinner, the house felt calm. Not perfect. Not carefree, but calm. The kids sat at the kitchen island finishing homework while I cooked. Evan came downstairs around 6. I noticed immediately that he was in a bad mood. The kind of mood that arrived before a storm. He opened the refrigerator, closed it, opened it again. Then he stared at the countertop. Alice had left colored markers spread across one corner. Nothing unusual, nothing permanent. Just evidence that a 7-year-old lived there. Evan picked one up between 2 fingers. Does every surface in this house need to become an art project? Alice froze. The marker cap slipped from her hand and rolled across the counter. I'm sorry. The apology came automatically. Too automatically. I hated that. Children shouldn't apologize for existing, especially not in their own home. It's fine, I said gently. Then I looked at Evan. It's washable. He laughed under his breath. That's not really the point. Number. It wasn't. The point was that he'd stopped pretending. Henry lowered his eyes back to his homework. Alice quietly gathered her markers. The room felt smaller. A few minutes later, Henry started telling me about his bridge project. He had spent the entire drive home talking about it. Now he was explaining load distribution using breadsticks. Honestly, the demonstration was pretty impressive. I was listening. Alice was listening. Even the dog next door was probably listening. Then Evan sighed. Loudly. Not accidentally. Not absent-mindedly. Intentionally. Henry stopped talking. The breadstick stayed frozen in his hand. Nobody said anything for a second. Then Evan shook his head. Sorry, long day. The words sounded harmless. The effect wasn't. The excitement drained right out of Henry's face. I sat there watching Henry shut down and realized I was done trying to explain this away. Whatever hope I still had for the relationship disappeared right there at the dinner table. After dinner, I sent the kids upstairs to start a movie. Then I walked into the guest room. Evan was sitting on the bed, scrolling through his phone. What now? The irritation in his voice made me strangely calm. We need to finish this. We already finished it. No. I shook my head. We've spent weeks pretending this situation is temporary. His eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I'm talking about my children. Immediately, he rolled his eyes. That tiny gesture said more than any argument ever could. There it is again. What? You act like everything is about the kids. I stared at him, because somehow he still didn't understand. Of course everything was about the kids. They were 7 and 9. I was their mother. That wasn't me choosing the kids over everything else. I was their mother. Taking care of them was simply part of my life. They're my children. And I'm supposed to come second forever? The moment he said it, everything suddenly made sense. Once he said it out loud, every complaint, every argument, and every fight we'd had suddenly made a lot more sense. He didn't want more room in my life. He wanted more room than them. I nodded slowly. Thank you. His forehead creased. For what? For finally saying it out loud. For the first time since the breakup, he looked uncertain. Not angry. Not defensive. Uncertain. Because somewhere in the middle of his frustration, I think he realized how bad that sounded. The problem was that it was true. And we both knew it. The next morning, I called Barbara. She answered on the second ring. Clara, you need to come get your son. Silence. Then, what happened? I've reached the end of my patience. Barbara exhaled heavily. I can't just... Barbara. I cut her off. My entire house has security cameras. Another silence. Longer this time. I have recordings of the harassment, the property issues, and every interaction that's happened since the breakup. Her tone changed immediately. What are you saying? I'm saying this situation ends now. She arrived that afternoon. The argument between mother and son lasted nearly an hour. Most of it happened outside. I wasn't interested in participating. I sat on the back deck with Henry and Alice eating popsicles. Eventually, Evan stormed back into the house. He packed one duffel bag, then a second, and eventually a third before finally leaving for the night. By sunset, he was gone. He wasn't gone permanently yet, but for the first time in weeks, he was no longer in the house. And for the first time in weeks, the house felt peaceful. The change was immediate. The kids laughed more, talked more, moved more freely. I noticed it within 24 hours. Apparently so did Mason. When he dropped the kids off a few days later, he glanced around the kitchen and said, "It feels different in here." I knew exactly what he meant. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last. 3 days later, while I was at work, my phone started vibrating. The notifications were all from my home security system, motion detected at the front door, inside the living room, and then in the driveway. At first, I assumed Evan was picking up more belongings. Then I opened the camera feed and saw him carrying my television toward a pickup truck. He wasn't alone. A man I'd never met was helping him load it. I stared at the screen, then at the television, then back at the screen. Because surely nobody was dumb enough to steal a TV from a house covered in cameras. Apparently, I had underestimated him. I called my neighbor Dave immediately. Dave was a retired Marine who treated lawn care like a full-time profession and considered himself the unofficial watchdog of the neighborhood. Dave. Clara? Evan is stealing my television. A pause. Then, on it! By the time I arrived home, Dave had parked his truck across the driveway. The television sat halfway to the pickup. The stranger helping Evan looked deeply uncomfortable. Evan looked furious. And Dave looked like he was having the best afternoon of his life. The second I stepped out of my car, the stranger pointed at me. Wait, that's the homeowner? Yes, I said. His face changed instantly. Then he looked at Evan. You told me this stuff was yours. Evan started talking. Fast. Way too fast. The stranger listened for about 5 seconds, then shook his head. Nope. And walked away. Just like that. Evan was suddenly standing alone beside a television he couldn't explain. I pulled up the purchase receipt on my phone. I didn't even need to show it. The damage was already done. He knew it. I knew it. Dave definitely knew it. You have 24 hours, I said. Evan looked exhausted. For the first time in months, genuinely exhausted. I don't have anywhere to go. Part of me almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered Henry asking if he should spend less time at home. The sympathy disappeared. That's not my problem anymore. The next day, a U-Haul truck pulled into the driveway. For 4 hours, Evan loaded boxes. Every time he tried to take something questionable, a lamp, a vacuum, even a kitchen appliance, I produced the receipt and the item went right back into the house. By late afternoon, the truck was full. The house was empty of him. He stood beside the driver's door looking up at me. For a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said, "One day you'll realize nobody else would have put up with all this." I stared at him for a second, genuinely surprised. After everything that had happened, that was still how he saw it. In his mind, he'd been the one making sacrifices. I almost laughed. When I finally stopped laughing, I shook my head. "I'm not looking for someone who puts up with my children, Evan. I'm looking for someone who actually wants them there." He didn't respond, because there wasn't anything left to say. A minute later, he climbed into the truck and drove away. I stayed in the driveway until the truck disappeared around the corner. Then I went back inside. Nothing in the house had changed physically, but the atmosphere felt different the moment I walked back inside. Nobody seemed to be bracing for the next argument, and for the first time in weeks, there was no tension hanging over every conversation. About 20 minutes later, Henry came downstairs carrying his bridge project and started talking before he even reached the kitchen. He talked for nearly 10 straight minutes. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody sighed. Nobody looked annoyed. A few minutes later, Alice covered half the dining table with craft supplies. Normally, I would have asked her to clean up. That day, I just let her create her mess. For the first time in weeks, both kids looked completely relaxed. The silence afterward felt strange, then wonderful. A week later, Henry and Alice were in the backyard digging a giant hole for reasons neither of them could adequately explain. The lawn was a disaster, there was dirt everywhere, and somehow Alice had managed to get glitter on her face again. Henry was giving excavation instructions like he was running a construction company, and both of them were laughing. They were simply laughing the way children are supposed to laugh when they feel completely safe. I stood on the deck watching them argue over the hole they were digging. I hadn't heard either of them laugh like that in months. Their argument made less and less sense the longer it went on, but neither of them seemed to care. For the first time in months, the house felt exactly the way it was supposed to.